everyone to A Novel Idea 2022. My name is Laurel and I'm part of the adult programming team at the Deschutes Public Library. The idea behind A Novel Idea is simple. Pick a great book for the community to read together, offer thought-provoking and relevant programming, and end with a visit from the author. This year we have two books, one for young readers, I Can Make This Promise by Christine Day, and one for adults, The Seed Keeper by Diane Wilson. Both authors will be joining us for two in-person events, one in Bend and one in Madras, the first weekend of May. Tickets for the events are free but required, and they're available on the library's website and in all branches. This is the 19th year of A Novel Idea, and it's become the biggest and most successful community-wide reading project in the state of Oregon. Thanks to the work of the Deschutes Public Library Foundation, the generosity of sponsors, and individual donors like you, A Novel Idea events remain free and open to the public. Thank you. The program tonight is Minnesota's Forgotten War and its Aftermath, presented by Joe Eggers. Joe is the Assistant Director for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. He has been involved in several projects through the center that explores Minnesota's memory of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 and its aftermath, including several lessons plans aimed at K-12 educators. If you in the audience have questions that come up during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A and we'll have Joe answer them at the end of the program. Thank you, Joe, for illuminating this historic conflict and the American policy towards Native peoples.
Oh, thank you, everyone. This is, I was telling Laurel beforehand, this is a real treat for me, especially in the pandemic. I don't get out and get to work with communities as much anymore as I used to. So the opportunity to talk with you tonight, or I guess in Oregon this evening, is a treat for me. So thank you so much. I want to start tonight with a land acknowledgement that the University of Minnesota and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies is located on Minnesota-Makoche, the homelands of the Dakota people, the Dakota Iowaday. If you're not familiar with these land acknowledgements, it's a small effort for us to acknowledge that these histories that we're talking about are very intertwined with today and present a real complicated and ongoing conflict. As lands ceded and unceded that the University of Minnesota occupies today are continue to be contested. And if you're interested in learning more about land acknowledgements and the land which we occupy, native-land.ca is a resource you can turn to begin with. So a little bit about me. I just want to point out I'm the one in the hat here. My name is Joe. I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I was just in Morocco a couple of weeks ago. It was my first time seeing monkeys and I was really excited. But this is a little bit of levity, right? This is a conversation that we're going to have tonight is really difficult. It's going to include some really uncomfortable truths about how our own society is been established and set up. Difficult topics about violence, physical, sexual, and emotional violence. And I always start off these conversations by saying, first and foremost, I am not an Indigenous person. I have no Native affiliation, nor am I an Indigenous scholar or expert. I am specifically looking at Native history through a very specific lens of genocide. So I'm really narrowing down thousands and thousands of rich cultural history into several centuries of tragedy and horror. And I don't want to come across as being an expert more than I am. So please keep that in mind. I think it's a really important in terms of how I frame and understand this history and this story. So I want to first talk about this book from my lens, from where I'm coming from, and as how are we framing genocide? Because I think to talk and have a conversation, we need to also be all sort of on the same page about what we're thinking of when we think of genocide. So maybe in the chat, or if you're interested, just share a little bit about what comes to mind when you're thinking of the term genocide. If anyone has any ideas or thoughts, or yeah, the Holocaust, And I think that is a really common one, right? We have this idea of numbers, especially, right? When we think about the Holocaust, it's 6 million people killed. The extermination of people, right? We're talking about this physical destruction of a group of people. Um, whether it's the Holocaust, it's Rwanda, Cambodia, we're essentializing it all down to physical violence, destruction of people. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to the past and not a current problem, right? We're thinking of genocides essentially being something with a start point and an end point, and not something that exists on a spectrum. So to begin, I think to frame this conversation, we'll look at the legal definition of genocide, and I think we see why this conversation is reflected in this idea of numbers of physical genocide, because that legal definition, that way that it's enforced within the United Nations Genocide Convention, really frames this in a physical way. And that's because of the way the term was debated. The convention passed back in the 40s, was a lot of compromise. And really, the only references to things that wouldn't necessarily be death would be D&E, right? Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And we can kind of see that already when we're reading The Seed Keeper, that manifests itself a little bit. But it's also important to remember when we're looking at genocide, and you don't need to read all of this, and we can share this later on, that genocide isn't, that it exists within the scholarly realm too, right? There's, as soon as genocide was defined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, it's been continually reassessed and reevaluated. New definitions that include some things and not others have been put forward. And so I put some of these other definitions on the screen. And for me, as someone who's really interested in how we define genocide, and especially looking at the experience of Native people in the United States, it helps me understand some of these past events that may be outside of that physical genocide, right? Some of these cultural aspects, especially, as someone who's really looked at boarding schools to help us understand the crime of genocide. So then to begin, then why are we talking about 1862 in 2022, right? It's 160 or 160 years later. Now I'm not a math person, but in Minnesota here, this conversation about the U.S. Dakota War is still very omnipresent. Right, a couple of years ago, when we thought about including Fort Snelling at Betote, which is one of the main historical sites in the Twin Cities here, just south of the airport. I don't know if anyone's been to the Twin Cities, but when you're landing at MSB Airport, right across the highway is Fort Snelling. It's something you cannot miss when you come into the Twin Cities here. But it's also the origin story of the Dakota people, something that, again, in Diane's book, she references. So including that reference to Dakota history, this part of this history that's been here for thousands of years, was very contentious. And Lake Calhoun, named after Vice President John C. Calhoun, has been renamed to Bede-Makaska. Again, something very contentious. This Lincoln billboard removed over revisionist history. So this idea that 1862 really still manifests itself today in Minnesota history. And when let's talk about the 1862 war being part of Minnesota's forgotten history. It's really part of a misnomer, right? There's a lot of conversation in Minnesota about this being something that's forgotten, something that we've ignored for a long time. And it wasn't really until the sesquicentennial in 2012 that we really began to reevaluate our own history. But the reality is that it's not, right? We can look through our own newspapers, through fiction, through all these different mediums to see that 1862 still permeates itself under a lot of conversations in Minnesota in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to even today. So it's really important then to have these conversations and understand why this is such an important part of history, not only for Minnesota, but national history of terms of federal policy towards Native peoples as well. So I know the Seed Keeper really relied heavily on talking about 1862, but I want to provide a little bit of grounding so you're all familiar and maybe a little bit of better understanding of what this war actually looked like. And I say war sort of in quotation marks. There's even the concept of calling it a war is not been clearly defined. Today, a lot of conversation calls it a conflict. Before it was called an uprising, which we reject as being very one-sided. The language around this conflict itself has been very divisive. But before August 1862, the Dakota people were on the brink of starvation. Again, I believe that Marie's experience and that reflection back in some of the flashback scenes of Seedkeeper reference this. Remember that this is in the midst of the American Civil War, that the United States was really primarily focusing on defeating the Confederates in the South and not maintaining its treaty obligations with the Dakota, which meant annuity payments, which meant grain, feed. All of that fell behind. And 1862 was a really hot summer here. The crops were failing. And the Dakota had been increasingly restricted to a sliver of land along the Minnesota River in southwest Minnesota. So on August 17th, we see this raid in Acton, Minnesota, in western Minnesota here, that resulted in the death of a settler family. And that evening, the Dakota decided that was enough, that they would throw off the burden, the chains of this oppressive American settler existence in Minnesota and retake the state. They had enough of these payments, these missed promises. And 2 days later, attacked New Ulm. And in this painting you have here on the right is the attack on New Ulm. And I believe on one of the well, New Ulm is a central part of the book. I remember that John takes Rosie to visit the city, and this battle references that, or this painting here references that battle. And what it gives us is for a lot of Minnesotans, this is that idealized image of what the U.S. Dakota War looked like. The idea of buckskin-clad Dakota men sneaking into the city to launch a sneak attack on unsuspecting settlers. And the reality is far from the truth, or far from this narrative. One is this uprising, or this rising against the settlers in Minnesota was acknowledged, knew it was coming, and several representatives working for missionaries, for federal agents working with the Dakota, warned that, look, we need to be aware that the payments are late, that people are unhappy, that people are starving. They knew that New Ulm would have been a vulnerable target because it was a frontier settlement that was sort of sparsely populated. But again, this legacy of the sneaky Dakota lives on in this popular imagery in Minnesota. It's also important to note that this painting is actually from 40 years after the war. And so despite it being the most popular image, it's painted by a guy who immigrated from Germany, had never been to New Ulm, had never interviewed anyone, just sort of made up this idea of what the attack looked like in his mind. So Fort Ridgely is attacked a couple of days later. Birch Coulee is attacked. The battle between Minnesota militiamen and Dakota, and all of these represent a series of defeats for the Minnesota militia by the Dakota. At this point, Lincoln is aware that this is a real problem and sends in federal troops. It culminates in the Battle of Wood Lake, which ultimately ends the U.S. Dakota War. Again, Marie's father in the story, we learn, is captured after the war, or after the battle, along with other Dakota men, are sent to Davenport, Iowa. 2 days later, the Dakota surrender. But we're talking about this 6-week conflict. This is a really short war, which really its legacy outsizes the real impact, or the real length of this actual conflict. And for me, the aftermath is actually far more interesting. On September 27th, military trials begin. At this point, it's important to note that there was no uniform response by the Dakota, whether or not there should be fighting. Not all Dakota decided to fight. There was not a unified Dakota front. But regardless, all the men they could find were arrested, and trials began on the 27th. I believe it was just under 400 men were put on trial and convicted. And these trials are really a perversion of justice. Many of the Dakota men did not speak English, had no access to lawyers, and were convicted in show trials that lasted oftentimes less than 5 minutes. An appeal from Bishop Whipley, who had been working with the Dakota near Lower Sioux, the reservation, to Lincoln, was able to. Lincoln had pardoned essentially all but 38 of the men were ultimately hung in Mankato. The women were far from spared as well. Women, children, and the elderly were sent to Pike Island near Fort Snelling. Here's an image of that concentration camp. But I think what's really startling for this is when we talk about concentration camps, we really think about, again, the Holocaust and that imagery, but we don't have to look any further than just a few miles down from my home here to find examples of a concentration camp. And at the slide at the beginning with the title is the Bedote, and Rosalie talks about this in the beginning as the origin site of the Dakota people. And the real horror to me, or one of the horrors of this, is that this concentration camp is at the same site of the Bedote. So you have the origin story of the Dakota and this final attempt at extermination all happening at the same place. And today now the site is a state park. And it wasn't until this year that Dakota actually had free access to this land. So imagine this place of immense value of importance to you. You have to pay to access just like anybody else. It's astounding. And by the summer of December, the 38 men are hung. Then following summer, the incursions into Dakota territory start. It was just really meant to be punitive measures against the Dakota, an effort to punish them at this point. But there was no tactical advantage. There was no threat of violence. There was no threat of the Dakota for any of the American settlements. This was purely meant to be punitive. And by 1863, bounties were established. And we see this really enforced mechanism to really finally eliminate all Dakota from the state of Minnesota. So I want to shift this a little bit into some of the themes that we got from Seedkeeper. And I know, and I was telling Laurel this beforehand, going through this, there's a lot of references to this very complicated and dark history. And I tried to narrow it really down to 3 thematic elements that we can get from here, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But first, I want to talk about anti-Indian policies of the 19th and 20th centuries, since they are referenced in the book. First being the bounty system. The state government here issued awards for the return of Dakota scalp. Here we have a scalp, or the bounty turned in for the scalp of Little Crow, who was the Dakota leader during the 1862 uprising. Little Crow himself was a reluctant participant, knew that the odds were stacked against Dakota, but still participated anyway. 2 years after the conflict, came back with his son and was shot. And I think a real perversion of this on the check, it has a Native person on there. I think that's a really sad irony. But you can find these calls for bounties in several of Minnesota's newspapers from this period, from 1862 to 1864-ish. This is a really commonly advertised and encouraged practice in Minnesota that largely went forgotten. It wasn't until the sesquicentennial in 2012 that we really began to really talk about and understand our own history here. And it's certainly not unique to Minnesota, right? This bounty system also existed elsewhere. California, during the gold rush of the 1840s, had its own bounty system. Other states encouraged bounties for Native peoples, and we don't talk about this nearly enough. It certainly wasn't the only punitive measure in Minnesota. The Dakota people are the only tribe in the country to actually have all of their treaties abrogated by congressional act, which means every treaty signed between the Dakota and the federal government, regardless of anything, was declared void. So all of those land secession treaties that were signed before 1862 were made illegal. So Dakota for a long time couldn't actually reclaim any of the land, didn't have any legal right. And I think that's also referenced in the book as well. That passed in the summer of 1863. And also as well as this act banning Dakota from the state. And that's actually something that exists on the records today. It is against federal law for Dakota to live in Minnesota. We know that that's not the case, that clearly Dakota have resettled, that still exists. And imagine living in a state where it's been deemed illegal for you to settle in. And I know Oregon has had its own history with racialized settlement laws. But those have been erased, and that still exists in Minnesota, which is again not something that we necessarily talk about. We also talked, Marie talks about laws that restricted Indian Native religion. That would have been part of the Code of Indian Offenses that were passed in 1883. This really restricts many aspects of indigenous religion, marriage, ceremonies, funerals. And these existed until 1978. And it was a response to some of these challenges to settler encroachment by Native peoples, to assert their own autonomy, to stand against white encroachment and efforts to civilize Native peoples. In 1887, we have the Dawes Act, which largely removed Native families from lands and sold excess lands to white settlers. Again, this destroys the cultural framework of a lot of Native families. Countless millions of acres of land were lost and have largely gone unreturned since then, especially in northern Minnesota here. And we think about some of these acts as being reflections of 19th century, something that happened in the 1800s. But the reality is these sorts of things continue on well into the 20th century. Notably with the 1953 with the Indian Termination Law, which is a series of laws meant to curtail tribal sovereignty and really turned jurisdiction over native lands to states themselves. So state by states could decide whether or not Native people had any sort of jurisdiction over their land to prosecute crimes, to enforce laws. And some tribes were successful in preventing this from happening, either through court actions or getting involved with the legal process or the political process. But by and large, they were not. And so this loss of sovereignty existed until fairly recently, and there's still dozens of tribes that are pursuing attempts to get their own sovereignty recognized, right? And that's a cornerstone of how we think of how the federal government interacts or engages with Native people, is this idea of sovereignty. But the reality is that it's not necessarily an even playing field. And the Indian Relocation Act forcibly removed Native people from homes and into urban areas. Minnesota or Minneapolis, where I live here, is a reflection of that. It has, I believe, one of the highest urban Native communities in the country, largely due to this resettlement of Native people in an urban area. And again, all of these are efforts to assimilate them. And again, this is referenced actually in Diane's email or interview, sorry, that she did with the library, but also in the book, the Indian Welfare Act removed Native youth from homes and placed them with white families. It's clearly an important part of Rosie's experience. And actually, Laurel, there's that article that if you could toss in the chat. This is something that's ongoing today, right? This isn't something that's 40 years ago. This is something that Minnesota here specifically is continuing to grapple with. The other part that I want to talk a little bit about is about boarding schools. I know that you've had a presentation already, so I understand that some of this might be a little refresher. And this is, again, a broad strokes overview on the topic. But boarding schools have existed as long as colonization in North America. As soon as the French, the Spanish, the English all settled in North America, there were boarding schools that accompanied them, especially to spread religion. These varied by different groups and what they looked like, but everyone had some sort of boarding school, some sort of forced education. But the main school, the one that really changed everything, was the Carlisle School, the United States Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, funded by Richard Henry Pratt. Was originally intended to be a prisoner camp, but realized that it was much easier to teach youth, that this was a better way to as what he said, kill the Indian, save the man. And I'll show you an example of that. Here we can see one of these images, and these were really common practices early on. On the left, we see what was intended to demonstrate the savagery of the youth as they came in, and on the right, success, the civilizing factor that these schools had on these youths. Hair was cut, clothes were taken away, language was banned, religion was forbidden, all in an effort to really civilize and turn Native youth into white members of society. And of course, it wasn't actually training them to be equals of white, right? It was largely for menial tasks, especially if the Industrial Revolution is taking place. It meant they could be farm hands or work in shops or do some of these menial tasks. But it was thought that this was a better way to assimilate them into white society than allowing them to continue to live on reservations. And it's important to also notice that the left is a stereotype, right? That by the 1890s and early 1900s, that this is not necessarily how all Native people dressed, but this is how the school wanted to demonstrate its effectiveness. That this was the idealized imagery that that white American civilization had of Native people, and so this is what these schools really played up. So in Minnesota here, we had 15 boarding schools, and I believe there were 7 in Oregon, although these numbers are not necessarily completely accurate. It's actually really difficult to track the number of schools that existed, because what constituted a boarding school really shifts a lot, right? Some of these schools were solely religiously organized and funded schools. Some were federally funded, some were some kind of hybrid of the both. So I would actually probably expect those numbers to be a little bit higher. But here's an image there from Warm Springs School. I think this is from 1890 in Oregon there. I think it's about a little over an hour from Bend there. But again, you see a lot of the similarity from the last image there, where we're trying to really destroy cultural identity within these kids, and really try to make them part of a white mainstream society here. So in the book, it talks a little bit about of Darlene's siblings being taken, right? And it was not uncommon. Families were forced or coerced to be sending their children in. Oftentimes, agents would go to houses and tell them that they wouldn't receive any food, wouldn't receive their money, any support, unless they sent their children into these schools. So it was really, they were given an impossible decision. But a lot of times, which is really tragic, is these schools or these families willingly sent their children because it was thought that there was nothing they could do, that resisting these attempts would be really pointless, which is again a real tragedy. And I don't think I have to state this; it should be clear. But again, emotional, physical violence was really commonplace, and then this in turn would then manifest itself in lingering legacies of this trauma within communities that we face today, that we see today, that is again referenced in the book. That obviously shouldn't come as a surprise. And then again, I think there's a lot of anti-Native sentiment that we need to talk about here. And again, racialized stereotypes have been around for as long as there's been European settlement in North America. And it really runs the gamut, right? We all have this idealized image, or this stereotypical idea of what these look like, and then probably found in especially mascots. Right, the really racist imagery of the Cleveland Indians, the Washington Redskins, but it also manifests itself elsewhere, right? Think of Last of the Mohicans, that James Fenimore Cooper novel of that noble savage, right? That I'm blanking on the tribes, the friendly in Mohicans names, but right there, that's an ideal 19th century idea of what a Native person should be like versus Magua, right? That treacherous, lying, deceitful Native. But these are pervasive everywhere. It's really, really hard to separate them. But it's all common. It's all meant to dehumanize, right? Especially in the 19th century, when we're trying to separate them from land, we're trying to do something. It's all part of this dehumanizing effort. And so, as these stereotypes, right? Not everyone who was a fan of the Cleveland Indians is necessarily racist, but it's all part of that effort to dehumanize Native people, whether they're conscious to it or not. And so I want to go through a couple of these images now. And this is something I think in Oregon, when I learned about Oregon and the Oregon Trail, this is something that always was really commonplace. Right, but here we have manifest destiny, westward progress, right? And we see Native people right off to the left in the dark. They're half naked. They're, it's very, they're fleeing from the civilizing nature of European encroachment. And I always, when we talk this with teachers, one of the things I always like to ask, and maybe you can probably see it, but when we're doing it on a big screen, it's maybe harder to tell, is if you can tell what that book she's holding is. I don't know if anyone wants to say in the chat, or I'll just say it. But it's a school book, right? A lot of people will say that it's a Bible, that their religion is meant to be this civilizing factor, but it's education, right? And so getting back to that idea of the boarding schools, it was really thought that education would be how we would be able to break Native people, especially in the 19th and early 20th century. And that's I think, especially when we're talking to teachers, is something that's really illuminating. And again, coming from Minnesota here, I'm sure you have Land O'Lakes butter, presumably. I guess I didn't think about that. But there's the image of this Native woman on the box here, right? This idealized image. And now Land O'Lakes has removed it, but for a long time, this stereotype was something that was existed on packaging, right? So this idea of stereotype manifests itself everywhere, right? It's not just athletics, it's in how we teach, it's in how we market products, it's everywhere. And lastly, and this is something that I could talk for a long time about, and this is something that I've been working on for several years now, is how the Dakota are represented in Minnesota's newspapers. Because newspapers are a really good barometer for understanding popular sentiment, popular culture, right? It's our newspapers are a historical record of sentiment. And so one of the things that we did as a center, one of the things I did as part of a research team, was look at newspaper accounts from the U.S. Dakota War from the Minnesota River Valley, right? So where Seed Keeper is taking place, and the Twin Cities here, and saw how the U.S. Dakota War was reflected. And one of the things we saw here was one of the factors we looked at is how the Dakota are referred to over the last 150 years, right? And so thinking about especially this dark blue line here, right? These derogatory terms that would have been red devil, savage, barbarians, things like that are coming up in our newspapers. And it's not just in that heat of war. It's years, 50 years later, even 75 years later, you're still finding that in our newspapers. Is astounding, right? So it's not as if this sentiment goes away. And again, it gets back to that idea that this isn't necessarily a forgotten conflict, a forgotten war. It's something that manifests itself continually as passed by generations. In Minnesota here, you can still find descendants of settlers who lived on farms that were attacked by Dakota 160 years later or earlier, who still hold on to that memory. And so this is a very present idea. And this isn't something that's necessarily unique to Minnesota. I would imagine if you look at newspapers from across, especially Western United States, where some of these conflicts occurred in the little later 19th century, this sentiment is probably more common than it is uncommon, but really gets at what we're talking about here, this anti-native sentiment, and especially what John is talking about with Rosalie in the book. And if you're interested, and this is a really, I don't mean to be wonky, but it's a really interesting look at how popular media covers events. Laurel just put a link to a presentation I did on that from a while ago. If you're interested in that, it's worth referring to. So, I mean, those are, in broad strokes, three themes that I picked up from reading Seed Keeper, especially looking at it through a lens of genocide. But one of the things that I'm left with back, especially reading the book, is what about this idea of land, right? The interview with Diane talked about this immense connection that she wants people to feel that between the Dakota and land, importance of environment, all of these things. But if we look back even to these expanded scholarly academic ideas of what genocide is, none of them really account for a connection to land, right? It's about violence and even maybe removing the culture and doing some of these other things. But I think it really ignores a significant part of understanding what happened to Native people, especially in regards to land and removal. And that's really what the shortcoming of genocide is. I think if you talk to any genocide scholar, no one's ever really happy with how we define genocide. And this is a clear example of why this isn't great, right? There needs to be more work. There needs to be continued analysis and continued exploration about what genocide is and means. for it to be really effective, for us to get a clear picture, right? Understanding what cultural genocide is, knowing that thinking about it as it expands beyond the physical destruction of Native people to account for boarding schools and some of these other events helps. But still, we're not understanding a clear picture. And I will say there is a colleague at the University of Manitoba named Andrew Wolford who's doing really amazing research right now in trying to really understand and define this, which is fantastic because this is a real blind spot in genocide studies. So I want to leave a lot of time here to talk about. There's a lot to unpack and talk about and discuss, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'll just say that too, my email address is here on the screen. If you have questions, if you want to know more, I'm happy to talk. On there too is our center's email address. We have resources beyond Native genocide. You can learn more about other opportunities that we have for programming. If you want to join our list, there's a list there. And then these slides are also available for everyone if you're interested in following along. I meant to say at the beginning, and I'm sorry, I get myself a little excited. So you can access these slides on your own if you want to go back and refer to them or use some of the images. By all means, please do.
Yep, I'll send all of that out and all those great resources to everyone in attendance. So Joe, we do have a couple questions here. Let me go back to where I saw this. Someone was talking about the concentration camp that you showed at the beginning that was at the site of the creation site of the Dakota people. And the question is, was the site of that intentional or just a really awful coincidence?
Yeah, it's a really awful coincidence. I mean, it wasn't unknown. I'm sure that there were leaders in Minnesota and the federal government who had known. Henry Sibley, who was the commander of the Minnesota militia that began these initial, fought in some of those initial battles, was the first Minnesota governor, also led the raids into Dakota territory. And I say Dakota territory, I mean North and South Dakota. In 1863, actually married a Dakota woman, had a child with her, was very ingrained with the Dakota community around here. So, I mean, I think it would be incorrect to say there was no knowledge of that, but that island of Betote is right below Fort Snelling, which is the first military establishment in Minnesota west of the Mississippi. It's a confluence of two really important navigable rivers. And it was a way then to keep an eye, to really assert power over the Dakota. So it was a very tactical decision. Plus, that following spring in 1863, the women were taken onto steamships and removed. It was really a lot about convenience. I would say primarily convenience.
And we have a couple questions kind of revolving around school and curriculum. What is the curriculum like in Minnesota regarding Minnesota Indigenous history? Do you study that in schools? I know that you've worked with educators through K through 12 on this.
Yeah, so I believe Oregon passed a mandate for Holocaust and genocide studies fairly recently, which means it's required teaching in Oregon schools. And Minnesota doesn't actually have anything like that. In 2011, Minnesota passed a series of standards, curriculum standards that include several benchmarks that include references to Dakota Native history. And so in Minnesota, it's primarily taught in sixth grade. So when we're developing lesson plans and curricula, it's targeted towards sixth graders. And I can, Laurel, what I can do is I can send you a copy of what we use as a lesson plan. You can see what we're doing for sixth graders. I don't know if it'll be interesting for people, but we have that. It's also on our website. but but the problem with standards, the problem with all curriculum, right, is there's no enforcement. We've done surveys of Minnesota teachers here and realized that actually very few are including any conversation about the 1862 war. And that's because it wasn't taught, right? Teachers teach about what they're familiar with and what they know about. That's why when you're talking about conversations about genocide in the classroom, it really revolves around the Holocaust and Rwanda, because teachers now, that's what they grew up with, that's what they're familiar with, and oftentimes leaves things like Indigenous genocide to be overlooked. So it's there, it's not super widely taught, but I could say I'm proud that that's one of the things that our center is working to correct.
Yeah, well, someone commented, I grew up in Oregon and remember studying state history in 4th grade and being told how horrible the Indians were because they brutally massacred poor, blameless homesteaders. And, you know, I was in 4th grade and we did the Oregon Trail project. And, you know, I remember I was so mad because my wagon team, we got, at the very last day we were going to win, and we got raided at the end. And I was so mad. And that was my takeaway on Native Americans in Oregon. And so it's fairly recent, but we did pass a state bill, I don't remember what, number 10, shared history, tribal history, where tribal history, 13, thank you, for Native history to be taught in schools.
I remember the first time I was in grad school, I did a presentation on resources for talking about Indigenous genocide with teachers. And there was a teacher from Oklahoma that actually come up to Minnesota for one of our workshops. And she said, you know, I had no idea of this history. And I thought to myself at that time, how can you be in Oklahoma, right? The destination site for Trail of Tears, such a state that was originally intended to be, you know, solely an Indigenous reservation. How can you not know this history? But what I've come to realize is, like, look, the teachers have it really hard. There's a lot that are required of them. There's a lot to be that we expect them to teach. And so rather than being sort of surprised and frustrated, I think that it's better to think about how can we empower teachers? How can we equip teachers with the best resources and the best approaches for having these conversations, so that we can avoid some of these things, right? Growing up in Wisconsin, which is their own complicated and contested history with Native people, I didn't talk about this either. And I think it's way more common, right? If we had a real frank conversation with everyone here, I would imagine a lot of us didn't have these conversations. And I think now is that time where we can change it. And this is why having these kind of community presentations for me are infinitely more exciting and more fulfilling than having an academic conversation at a conference, because I think collectively we have that ability to change some of these things, right? To ensure that these conversations, that these histories aren't ignored or forgotten. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. We have another question about, I'm wondering about blood quantum and how that plays into the erasure of Native people.
Oh, yeah, this is a really good question. So blood quantum originally was this is an area where I'm not a real expert. So I will admit my own shortcoming. But blood quantum was a way to establish who could qualify for some of these tribal memberships, and has been adopted by several tribes in order to keep an idea of what roles look like, what their membership looks like. But the challenge is, with each generation, right, this blood gets diluted in theory. And so a lot of tribes have had real challenges with maintaining membership. And the tragedy is that a lot of this ignores how a lot of tribes had counted their members, right? It was bonds between adopted families that don't necessarily reflect blood and other factors. There's a really good presentation that I went to from a woman who's part of the Fond du Lac Ojibwe in Minnesota, and what they're doing right now is actively working to repeal their blood quantum rule, because it doesn't really matter, right? Tribes can largely establish who they can extend membership to, and this is an effort to reestablish that idea of sovereignty, right? And that important component of Native identity. So, and Laurel, what I can do too is I can get a link to that presentation because it was actually really good, and she's actively working on that campaign, and it's a much better way than I can kind of explain it in a couple of minutes here if people are interested in learning more about blood quantum.
It's a whole nother presentation. Yeah, I would love to have that and share that resource.
Yeah, I do feel kind of bad. I have, between the things that Laurel shared and the comments here, I think for this little half-hour presentation, I've given about 5 hours of extra material. So I tend to do that.
Well, start small and then we can
chip
away. And we have a couple other questions. Why do you think the term genocide isn't associated, with Indigenous history very much and what's been done to Native peoples?
Yeah, this is really hard, and this is a really complicated. And this is another one of those questions that we could spend an awful lot of time discussing. I think it comes down to a couple factors. One is this idea of American exceptionalism, right? Part of what makes the Holocaust a neat story to talk about is because it portrays us as the victor or as the savior, right? We came in and we liberated the camps, we're the heroes, rescuing European Jews. And the reality is that this and our own treatment of Black Americans really complicates that idea of us being the virtuous, noble heroes. No one really wants to admit their own problems, right? If we look at perpetrators of genocide, very few countries are very frank and open and honest about their own complicity in committing genocide. I think you can look towards Germany and its own efforts towards reconciliation, reparations towards European Jews, and now even in the Herero in Namibia from the 1905 genocide as being really sort of excellent examples of states actually acknowledging their own role. I think two is this idea that it's hard to look at this genocide as a singular event. The hardest question I was ever posed in grad school was, by a faculty member, was, can you point to Native American genocide, or what do we see is a series of targeted genocides against individual tribes? And the answer is probably both. But I think what makes American policy towards Native people is a lot of it can be pointed towards individual tribal interactions, right? We look at Dakota, it's this abrogating all of the treaties, it's the forced removal in 1863, it's all of these little things. And so all of those little things can point to a larger picture of genocide. But when you look at it, it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? Also, we don't tend to really think about things that are outside that physical realm. Right, so that idea of the boarding schools, of the Welfare Act, the termination laws. We didn't talk about the forced sterilization in the 1970s. Like, those are things that we don't necessarily also really think of, but in any other context would be genocidal. And so I think that's a real challenge. understanding. And two, look, I think part of it is a lot of these, not all of them clearly, but a lot of these things happened before the Genocide Convention came into force. And so there is, I think, a little bit of hesitation historically about applying a legal crime, a threshold against events that happened before that law was enforced, right? That's a really kind of gray area, and I reject that idea. I think most scholars reject that idea, but I think there might have been some of that hesitation there too. But yeah, we're talking about several factors here, but those would probably be the biggest two would be American exceptionalism and this idea of several small things that led to genocide.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to get a photo of, the trauma from a boarding school. So.
Well, and I think too, and sorry, one other thought is this idea, and someone pointed out at the beginning, is like, right, this idea that genocide has a beginning and the end. But if you look at this interaction between Native people and the federal government, you could really argue that genocide is still ongoing, right? There's things that have been, the harm that has been done that continues to be perpetrated between generations that we haven't done anything to address. And so how do you acknowledge a genocide that continues to be ongoing? I don't know. I mean, that's a really hard question and a really hard thing to explore.
And we've had a couple comments on, what we can do to, with this information, and, a couple calls on how do we correct these wrongs or even get land back into Native people's hands, as one person says.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and not one that has a really good answer. I hate to do it, but I'm going to reference to another event that we did in 2021, where we talked about with Native scholars about what does reconciliation look like to you as a Native person, and someone said it looks like returning land, which is a really difficult proposition, right? Not only is returning land that's settled by families an incredibly difficult, but it's also really, really expensive, right? This land now that is occupied in Minnesota here is some of the most valuable real estate in the state, and you're talking about that on a national level is hard. So in Minnesota here, that looks like taking the path of looking through education, right? So Minnesota now is offering free college tuition to tribal members living in Minnesota here. And that's something that began at the University of Minnesota Morris, which is out in western Minnesota on the border with North Dakota, and now has been expanded to all of the University of Minnesota schools as a small effort to restore some semblance of justice, some kind of equality. And I think the reality is we have to kind of concede that like nothing is going to ever make things better, right? This is never going to be necessarily remedied. And I applaud in places that are having these conversations. Bemidji in northern Minnesota here is an ongoing Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which really is meant to engage in conversations between community and Native people about, reshaping relationships, reframing their collective existence. And that's something that we've seen a lot internationally. Right? We think about the truth and reconciliation as being something I think that happened in post-apartheid South Africa. It's happened in several Latin American countries that have experienced mass violence and genocide. But it's not something that we've necessarily had conversations about here with our own episodes of genocide. I think Maine there's a town in Maine that also began a truth and justice process. And of course, Canada had a truth commission that issued a report a few years ago. And while that's a really amazing thing that included remedies that aimed at reforming education and improving the lives of Native people, it's important to remember that that was a threat of a lawsuit. It wasn't that the Canadians had decided that out of the goodness of their heart that they would actually change and acknowledge what happened in the past. First Nations people in Canada had threatened to sue. They threatened to sue the largest civil lawsuit, I think, in world history, certainly Canadian history. And the prospect of that led to an apology from then Prime Minister Stephen Harper and this commission that established a bunch of protocols and calls for reform. And then, of course, a lot of those have been ignored, and so they look good on paper. Yeah, this is a really complicated thing. I would say the best is the first step is having these conversations, being aware of your own land's history, being able to confront these and engage with these conversations when you can, is a powerful first step. And I'll be honest, I don't know if a lot of people in the United States are even willing to understand or acknowledge that. Right? We see that in our own conversations over race in the wake of the George Floyd protests, that there is a lot of hesitancy to question power dynamics in American society. And this is, I think, another example of where I'm not sure that we're there.
I was just looking for that map that it's like nativeland.ca.
Oh,
Here we go.
yeah.
Here we go. And I'll put this in the chat. This is so that we can see who lived here and lives here today.
Yeah, and I should have done that before. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. Yeah, I mean, we have people talking about feelings of guilt and yeah, and the education, the extra resources that we can educate ourselves with that Joe provided, I think, can give a nice broader understanding of the trauma that Native peoples in our own state and over in Warm Springs have experienced.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is like, right, that guilt is not an uncommon feeling. I think when we especially talk to people who are unfamiliar with this history, but I think you should find some empowerment in knowing that by coming to these presentations, by reading Diane's book and doing some of the other things, you're already doing more than the overwhelming majority of people will do. And I think, that's a wonderful first step. This series of events is a great first step in getting educated, and then finding that place. There can be a lot of fatigue involved with advocating for some of these things, but no, I think you should first just. I want to say that I appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
Well, and Joe, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about Minnesota's history and how it reflects on the larger national history, and giving us some more information to look at, including the boarding school in Warm Springs, so in our own backyard. So I really appreciate you helping us have this conversation and starting us. So, did you have any last thoughts?
No, thank you so much. And like I said, this is what I really enjoy doing. So please, if you want to learn more, I've sent Laurel a whole bunch of stuff that I know she'll be sending out to you. So if you have questions or something's not terribly clear, because I know when I present, I get really excited and I talk kind of fast. Please, send me an email. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to share more resources. This is a topic that is largely under discussed, and so I'm just grateful to have people who are interested.
Yeah, thank you for your diligence in sharing this with us and your humble attitude. So Hope you have a wonderful rest of your night, and thank you everyone for joining us. Hope to see you at other Novel Idea events.